So primordial sociality is related to wild being. And so, the reason that I want to bring that up specifically is because that is to my mind, like the cutting edge of our understanding of sociality with respect to that meta level of wild being. That's the thing that we don't really understand very well. So anyway, there's a few books on this that I've been collecting over the years. And so I thought I'd tell you about the people who have considered this problem. Wild being was defined by Merleau-Ponty in The Visible and the Invisible. It was named in honor of The Savage Mind by Levi-Strauss. It's described as a chiasm or a reversibility, or as the flesh of the world. It's an esoteric kind of being, which is the dual of hyperbeing, which is like difference of Derrida. So when Deleuze talks about it, he calls it drift. Another kind of analogy for it is the one that Cornelius Castoriadis comes up with in The World in Fragments and other works that he did of magma. So he talks about it as magma. And so it turns out that, like, for instance, Schelling had an idea of the barbarian principle, which influenced Merleau-Ponty in his formulation of wild being that you can see in the Ages of the World. And then Jaspers has these ideas of foundering and encompassing that's in his 3-volume work on philosophy. And there's another book, which I really like, by Stephen Martineau, called Forms in the Abyss, where he talks about something called sculptured glyphs. And so I think that's a reference to wild being from a positive point of view. In other words, trying to say what positive entities in wild being would be like. And he has this idea of incommensurability between philosophies and how you can't do just isomorphisms between concepts in different philosophies. You have to come up with homeomorphisms. And so when you're in that realm that's between the incommensurable philosophies, he says that's where these sculptured glyphs appear. And then recently I read a book, which I'd had a long time, but I hadn't read, called The Wild Region in Life History by Tegelia, Laszlo Tegelia. And that is a book specifically on wild being, which is quite interesting. And then Leotard wrote Discord Figure, and he mentions wild being in that. And then, of course, the major proponent of the study of wild being is Deleuze in Logic of Sense, in Anti-Oedipus, in Difference and Repetition, in What is Philosophy. Basically, all of his works are one way or another about wild being. So that'll give you an idea of where it is in the tradition of continental philosophy. Those are the figures who have tried to think what wild being is, but really not enough effort has gone into this, and more work needs to be done, because as you go up these meta levels of being, it gets harder and harder to think each meta level of being. And so ultra being is unthinkable. So wild being is just before you fall into ultra being, which is kind of like a black hole. It's like the event horizon of the black hole of ultra being is wild being. And so it's very difficult to think what wild being is. So more work needs to be done. But I've got a kind of model that will allow us to kind of think about this issue a little further. And that is that Heidegger had these hidden books, one of which is called Contribution to Philosophy, that were published in the 70s and 80s and are just now filtering into English translations, where he defined something called Beying, B-E-Y-N-G, which he says is kind of like the obverse of being, questioning the idea of the ontological distinctions that he makes in being and time. And being is described as strange, unique, and onefold. It's kind of like if the ontological distinction between being as a concept and beings as concrete things collapses, together, then you get this thing called bang. And the emphasis in bang is on closure rather than disclosure. Being in time, it's all about disclosure, but in contributions, he's concentrating on the question of closure, which is seen as more primordial than the disclosure. You have to be closed before you can become disclosed. And when you go from bang to being, you get this striation. So there's unstriated bang and there's striated being. And that striation gets seen in the application of ramified hierological types to the concept of being in order to kind of solve its paradoxes. But ultimately, because of Gödel, we know that it's really impossible to solve those paradoxes. But if you apply ramified theory of hierological types to the concept of bang, then what you get is a differentiation of classes with types at each level. And those types are the aspects of being, which is identity, truth, presence, and reality. But then when we ask ourselves, what are the differences between these different kinds of being? Then the answer to that is that it's different kinds of existence. So there's these different models of existence which come from special systems theory. And so basically, if you go from the system, the dissipative ordering special system, to the autopoietic symbiotic special system, to the reflexive ordering special system, to the meta system, those differentiations of the models of existence are what distinguish the meta levels of being from each other. So anyway, that's an overall model that allows us to think about the relationship between being and existence. So if you're looking at the difference between being and bang, basically, ontological difference is negated in bang. And so bang is strange, unique, and onefold, whereas being is striated into the different kinds of being. So what I'm laying out here are these different strange terms from fundamental ontology, like bang and ultra being and existence. And so Heidegger introduced bang and contributions to philosophy as the reverse of ontological difference, which is what he comes up with being and time when he defines fundamental ontology. And so being's internal differences can be understood in terms of the series of meta levels of being based on the ramified hierological type theory of Russell. You can look at Brentano's on the several states of being in Aristotle as a kind of foundational text that Heidegger started with when he was an undergraduate thinking about these things. He was given that book as a gift when he won a prize. And so he became obsessed with being and the different kinds of being and so forth. Ultra being is a singularity of being within the field of existence at that fifth meta level. Phase transition occurs from being to existence. So existence, which we can associate with wajud in Arabic, is represented by special systems theory and the emergent metasystems, and appears at the fifth meta level of being of the higher logical types. So the main point here is that being and its relation to existence is complicated in our tradition. It's not a simple, straightforward thing. Now that we have the history of continental philosophy, fundamental ontology and continental philosophy, which has been exploring this stuff for quite some time. So basically here, I just want to kind of contrast the difference between wild being as the most esoteric kind of being before you get to existence, and what I call existential sociology, which is based on special systems theory. And basically what happens is you've got the special systems and then the system, and that forms a cycle, which I call the emergent metasystem cycle. And what's interesting is that when we look out for different examples of this, many of which we can find in Buddhism and Taoism and so forth, what we see is that in Chinese society, they developed a model of this emergent metasystem in the game of Go and Wei Qi in China, which is a fascinating thing that if you can imagine someone kind of discovering this model of existence and then codifying it into a games so that it gets passed on in culture, even though people don't realize what they're doing when they're playing that game. But there are a few images of this emergent metasystem cycle in the Western tradition. One of the best of them is Deleuze's book on Bergsonism, where he talks about the different modes of the virtual, the actual, the real, and the possible as these different modes of the cycle. But it also appears in Hegel in his preface to Phenomenology of Spirit, which is as a natural cycle of seeds to leaves to flowers to fruit. And the same kind of cycle is mentioned by Schelling in Ages of the World, and even appears in Blake's Four Zoas at the end in terms of a harvest analogy.